So, as a philosopher, I'm sure you spent plenty of time thinking about reason and intuition, how they kind of played off each other.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But have you ever thought about like a whole tradition where this wasn't just some debate, but like actually baked into how they did philosophy?
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. The whole mysticism and philosophy thing in the Arabic and Islamic intellectual traditions.
Okay, cool.
We've got a ton of sources here that show how thinkers over centuries from all different schools of thought, they brought mystical insights into their philosophies. It's really fascinating.
I'm intrigued already.
Our goal today is to really unpack this whole relationship, introduce you to some of the major players, and see how their ideas about knowledge, reality, truth, how all that stuff, still speaks to us as philosophers today.
Right. Yeah, I can see how that would be relevant.
It all starts with the Quran, right?
Yeah.
That's the foundation of Islam. And what's crazy is that even there you see this blending of mystical and philosophical ideas.
Oh, really? How's it so?
Certain verses, they weren't always taken literally. Some thinkers who were into both mysticism and philosophy, they saw these verses as having deeper meanings like allegories or esoteric secrets.
Oh, wow, that's so different from how many people approach religious texts.
I know, right? It's like
All
they
right.
believed that there was wisdom hidden beneath the surface, accessible not just through reason alone.
Yeah, like you need something more than just logic to unlock it.
Exactly. And one of the big examples is the verse that says, God is the outward and the inward, 57.3.
Yeah. How do you even begin to reconcile those two ideas with just reason?
Right. It's like a paradox, and that's where the mystical interpretation comes in.
So it's like the text itself was seen as having these mystical layers built in.
Exactly. And we have sources that show how guys like Shihab al-Din, Suhrawardi, and Mullah Adra, they even wrote whole commentaries dedicated to these verses.
Really, wow. So they were really trying to tease out those deeper meanings.
Oh, yeah. And a great example is Mullah Adra's work on the light verse. This shows us that for these thinkers, philosophy wasn't about imposing outside ideas onto the Quran.
It was more like a way of uncovering and understanding this mystical dimension that was already there.
Right. It was part of the tradition from the very beginning.
That's really cool. And how did this mysticism actually become a part of Islamic intellectual life?
So there are two main ways that the sources highlight.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, you have practical Sufism, which is all about directly experiencing esoteric knowledge through things like spiritual practices and purifying the self.
Yeah, that makes sense, like the experiential side of things.
Right. But then, and this is super important for our philosophical exploration,
Mhm.
you see key aspects of this mysticism getting woven into how Islamic philosophical schools did their thing.
So it's like they're taking those mystical experiences and trying to make sense of them philosophically.
Exactly. So you have these two pillars, the lived experience of the mystic and the reasoned articulation of the philosopher, and they often feed off each other.
I like that image, the two pillars supporting this whole tradition.
And here's where things get super interesting for a philosopher. Our sources point to the huge influence of Neoplatonism.
Neoplatonism, that rings a bell, but remind me.
Yeah, so it was this dominant philosophy back then, heavily influenced by Aristotle, but with a good dose of Plato, especially the ideas about a hierarchy of realities stemming from a single source.
Oh, right.
And while Al-Kindi is seen as the first Muslim philosopher, it was Al-Farabi in the 10th century who went all in on Neoplatonism.
And that's why he's so important for understanding this whole mysticism thing.
You got it. It's like he laid the groundwork for mystical ideas to really take root in Islamic philosophy.
So what was it about Neoplatonism that made it so appealing to Islamic thinkers?
Well, for one, it tackled some big metaphysical questions in a monotheistic context.
Yeah, like how does the one God create the many, the universe, all that?
Exactly. And Neoplatonism had this idea of emanation.
Emanation. Okay, what's that again?
So imagine reality flowing from a single perfect source, like light from a lamp. That was their model.
Okay, I can kind of picture it. So God is like the source, and everything else emanates from him.
That's the gist of it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just some abstract theory.
Oh, so there was a practical side to it, too.
Totally. It offered this blueprint for a philosophical life aimed at intellectual and spiritual ascent, which ended up influencing how they thought about ethics and contemplative practices.
So how did this mystical take on Neoplatonism show up in Al-Farabi's work?
Well, our sources point to both philosophical and practical stuff.
Okay, break it down for me.
Philosophically, his interpretation of the four intellects in the letter concerning the intellect is key.
What's so special about that?
It basically suggests that there's a way to get knowledge that goes beyond just thinking things through step by step.
So like a deeper kind of knowing?
Exactly, like intellectual intuition or even illumination.
That's fascinating. And what about the practical side?
So, in his political philosophy, he has this idea of an imam, a leader whose grasp of truth is intuitive, you know? And this imam replaces Plato's philosopher king.
That's a pretty significant shift.
hmm
So he's basically saying that you don't need to be a super logical brainiac to lead.
Yeah, you need intuition, a different way of knowing.
And did Al-Farabi actually practice Sufism himself?
That's debated, but some Sufi orders adopted his musical compositions.
Really?
Yeah.
So maybe there was a deeper connection there even if he didn't explicitly call himself a Sufi.
Yeah, a kind of intuitive alignment, you know?
I could dig it.
Okay, so now let's talk about Avicenna, or Ibn Sina as he's known in Arabic.
Bring on the Avicenna.
Our sources point to this debate among scholars that's relevant to any philosopher, really.
Oh, what's that?
Was Avicenna mainly a rationalist, like a lot of Western scholars think, guys like Gudis and Adamson?
Okay, sure, I can see that.
Or did he get more into mysticism later on, as many Muslim scholars argue?
Yeah, there's always that tension when you're dealing with thinkers who wrote so much.
Right? How do you reconcile everything?
Exactly.
So it's a really complex picture, but for a good chunk of his work, Avicenna does come across as this giant of rationalist philosophy, big on Aristotelian logic and Neoplatonic metaphysics, all super rigorously analyzed.
Yeah, he was a system builder for sure.
And his goal, like many before him, was to understand reality. You know, the relationship between God and the cosmos, all that heavy stuff.
And how did he go about that?
Well, famously, he used that Neoplatonic idea of emanation to explain creation.
Oh, right, that light from a lamb thing.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that same framework was also used by Sufis and Gnostics to describe the soul's journey toward the divine.
So even if Avicenna was mainly rational, the tool he used had mystical applications.
Exactly. It's all connected in a way.
That's mind-blowing. But what about this idea that he got into mysticism later on? Is there any actual evidence for that?
Oh, yeah, there's some pretty compelling stuff. The 9th chapter of his Remarks and Treatments, specifically the section called On the Stations of Knowers.
On the Stations of Knowers. Okay, that sounds promising.
It really is. In this section, Avicenna actually seems to be explaining and even defending the methods that Sufis use to reach truth.
Wow, so he's not just dismissing them, he's engaging with their ideas.
Yeah, and on top of that, you have his allegorical Persian treatises, Treatise on Ascendance, Treatise on Birds, Ibn Yaqsan, which is this philosophical romance about self-discovery through experience and reason, leading to mystical insight.
So he's playing with these mystical themes and symbols in his writing.
And then there's Treatise on Love and his Ode of the Soul. All of these are full of stuff that points to a deep engagement with mystical ideas, especially in his later years.
Okay, so it's not so black and white with Avicenna. He was a rationalist, but he wasn't afraid to explore other ways of knowing.
Right, a much more nuanced picture emerges.
I like it. Makes him even more interesting as a philosopher.
Now buckle up, because things are about to get shaken up with Abu Hamid Ghazali.
What did he do?
He basically rejected philosophy after a period of serious doubt and went all in on Sufism.
Wow, hold on a minute. A philosopher rejecting philosophy, that's a huge deal.
I know, right? A total game changer. He was this super respected Orthodox theologian and a master of logic, but he went through this massive intellectual and spiritual crisis.
Okay, I need to hear more about this crisis.
So in his book, The Incoherence of Philosophers, he argues that reason alone can't grasp the ultimate truths and that it even leads to contradictions.
So he's saying reason has its limits.
Exactly. And then he embraced asceticism and Sufism, which he documents in his autobiography, Deliverance from Error.
So he turned to mystical experience as the path to certainty instead of philosophical speculation.
Yeah, it's a pivotal moment where a leading intellectual figure prioritizes direct experience over abstract thought.
And what kind of Sufism did Ghazali embrace? Was it a complete rejection of Islamic law and tradition?
Not at all. He remained a devout Sunni Muslim. His Sufism was all about integrating mystical experience with Orthodox beliefs and practices.
Oh, okay. So he wasn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. He just saw Sufism as a way to revitalize religious life.
Right, and you see this in his works like The Niche of Light, which is all about the mystical symbolism of light, and it actually influenced later philosophers like Suhrawardi.
So his ideas had ripple effects even in philosophical circles.
Definitely. And then there's his massive work, Revival of Religious Sciences, where he devotes huge sections to explaining and promoting Sufi doctrines and practices.
So he was a systematizer, too. He wanted to ground Sufism in a solid framework.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's look at the Ismaili tradition.
What's their take on all this?
They took a different route. They actively incorporated Hermetic and Greco-Alexandrian mystical teachings into their own philosophy.
Oh, so they were drawing from a wider range of sources.
Yeah, and they developed this complex cosmology and metaphysics. It's fascinating.
Break it down for me. What kind of stuff did they believe?
Well, they were into Neoplatonic emanation. They thought asceticism and inner purification were super important. They saw the body as a potential obstacle to spiritual realization.
Okay, so far so good.
And they placed a high value on Gnostic knowledge marifa, which they believed could be attained through interpreting scripture esoterically, tawal.
So like finding the hidden meanings in the text.
Exactly. And all of this was done under the guidance of their imams.
They were the authorities, right?
Yeah. And to top it off, they also incorporated sacred geometry and this idea of cyclical patterns of prophecy.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's a rich tradition. And our sources mention some key figures.
Okay, let's hear about them.
So there's Jabir ibn Ayyan, who's actually better known for his contributions to alchemy.
Alchemy, really?
Yeah, but he also dabbled in a mystical interpretation of letters and numbers.
Huh, that's interesting. Like a hidden code in language itself?
Right. And then there's Abu Yaqub Sijistani. He wrote these profound esoteric commentaries on Ismaili doctrines.
What was he focused on?
He was all about the soul's journey and its ultimate liberation from the material world. You can check out his works like Unveiling of the Hidden.
Unveiling of the Hidden. I like that title. Very mysterious.
Right. And then there's Abu Taym Razi. He used the Neoplatonic concept of emanation to understand the nature of prophecy in his book Science of Prophecy.
So he was connecting philosophical ideas with religious concepts.
Exactly. And we can't forget Thamid al-Din Kirmani. He was a super systematic thinker who laid out a whole path to spiritual and intellectual perfection in his book Repose of the Intellect.
Repose of the intellect. That sounds like a philosopher's dream.
Right, achieving that perfect state of understanding. And then there's Naush Shra, who really tried to bridge the gap between Sufism and rational inquiry.
Oh, that's interesting. How did he do that?
In his book, The Sum of the Two Wisdoms, he argues that true philosophical wisdom and genuine religious understanding are actually in harmony.
So you're saying they complement each other?
Yeah, and the key to this harmony is understanding the nature of the soul.
So the soul becomes this central point connecting philosophy and religion.
Exactly. And we also have the Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan Alaf, which was this influential encyclopedic work that promoted a blend of philosophy, science, and mystical ideas.
So they were trying to create a holistic understanding of knowledge.
Exactly. Now, here's something important that our source didn't point out.
What's that?
There's this common narrative that after Ghazali, there was a decline in philosophy.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that before. Like he killed it off with his critique.
But that's not the whole story.
Really?
What happened then?
Well, down in southern Persia, there was a school of thought that flourished called the School of Shiraz.
The School of Shiraz. Okay, I've never heard of that.
They were actively combining rationalism, mysticism, and popular Sufi practices.
So they were keeping the philosophical tradition alive.
Yeah, and this challenges that simplistic view that philosophy just died out after Ghazali.
That makes sense. And were there any other important figures during this time?
Oh, yeah. From Islamic Spain, you have guys like Ibn Masara, who was all about the mystical quest for underlying unity.
Okay, so he was big on that oneness of everything.
And then there's Ibn Azm, who explored all the nuances of mystical love.
Fascinating. So he was looking at the emotional and spiritual side of things. And Ibn Bajjah, he wrote about the potential for both intellectual and mystical intuition.
So he saw those two as being intertwined.
And then there's Ibn Fail, whose philosophical allegory, Ibn Yaqsan, is all about reaching mystical insight through reason and experience.
Okay, Ibn Yaqsan, I've actually heard of that one. It's like a Robinson Crusoe story, but with a philosophical twist.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of big names, we have to talk about Sheikh Motia al-Din ibn Arabi, a.k.a. the Great Master.
He's a legend.
Mhm.
And his doctrine of the unity of being, Watat al-Wujud, is a mind-blowing synthesis of Gnostic and Sufi thought.
Yeah, for a philosopher, the idea of ultimate unity underlying all existence, that's a goldmine.
It is. His works like The Bezels of Wisdom and Meshin Victories present this incredibly complex and influential mystical philosophical system.
Okay, so break it down for me. What's this Wadat al-Wujud all about?
Well, it's often debated and sometimes misunderstood as pantheism, but essentially it's about a fundamental oneness of reality where everything created is like a manifestation or a self-disclosure of the single ultimate divine being.
So everything is a reflection of God in a way.
Yeah, and Ibn Arabi saw the cosmos as this tapestry of signs ayat that need a spiritual hermeneutics tawal to understand.
So you need a special kind of interpretation to grasp the deeper meaning.
Exactly. And for him, the universal man, al-insana kamil, represents the perfect realization of this unity.
Wow, that's a powerful image. The human being as the embodiment of this divine unity.
It is. Now, around the same time, we see Sheikh Shihab al-Din Suhrawardi founding the school of illumination, Ishraq.
Okay, so another major school of thought emerges. What were they all about?
Well, Suhrawardi was a philosopher who was really into both rational inquiry and mystical experience.
So he's trying to bridge that gap.
Exactly. And he built upon the peripatetic tradition, but he shifted the focus from being to light and illumination.
That's a big change in perspective. For a philosopher, that's a huge shift.
It is. And his main work, The Philosophy of Illumination, argues that knowledge ultimately comes from a direct experiential knowledge by presence. Ilma or
So like a kind of intellectual intuition or inner illumination.
exactly, not just thinking things through, but a direct knowing.
And his Sufi writings often use allegory and symbolism to emphasize the importance of practical wisdom, like asceticism and contemplation.
Yeah, it's all about preparing the soul for that illumination.
So did Suhrawardi's ideas have much impact on other thinkers?
Oh yeah, big time. His work led to a closer connection between philosophy and mysticism, thanks to commentators like Qutb al-Din Shirazi.
So he inspired others to follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, and the school of Shiraz continued to develop with figures like Jalal ad-Din Dawani, who explored both traditional philosophy and esoteric themes, even in his work on ethics.
Really? Like he was bringing those mystical insights into a seemingly secular field.
Exactly. His book, Sparks of Illumination and the Virtues of Ethics, is a great example.
So he's showing how ethical living can be a path to spiritual understanding.
Right, and then there's Ghaith al-Din Manar Dashtaki, another key figure in the later Shiraz school. He brought together peripatetic philosophy, Ishraqi doctrines, theological principles, and Gnostic ideas, all influenced by Ibn Arabi.
Wow, that's a grand synthesis. He's really trying to create a comprehensive system.
Yeah, and during this period, we also have other thinkers like Nalar al-Din Usi, known for his work in logic and ethics,
Okay, sure.
and Afdal al-Din Kashana, a Sufi poet and philosopher who believed that philosophy could help the soul on its journey towards God.
So he saw philosophy as a spiritual tool.
Exactly. Now, our exploration takes us east to India.
Okay, interesting. What was happening there?
So philosophical mysticism and Sufism gained a foothold there with the Ghaznavid conquests in the 11th century.
Okay, so it's spreading geographically.
Right, and there were some important figures like Abu Lisan Ali Hudwari, whose book Unveiling of the Veiled is a foundational text on Sufism.
So he was like a key figure in bringing those ideas to India.
Yeah, and the Ismaili missionaries who were there before seem to have paved the way, making the intellectual environment more receptive.
So it's like they planted the seeds for these ideas to flourish.
Exactly. And by the 14th century, with more Persian migration and intellectual patronage during the Mongol period, mystical philosophy really took off in northern India.
So political and social factors played a role too.
Oh yeah, for sure. And thinkers like Taftazani and Jurjani, who were big on logic and theology, they set the stage for guys like Mir Fatah al-Shirazi, who made sure that mystical philosophy was included in educational curricula.
So they were institutionalizing these ideas.
Exactly. And in later Indian traditions, we see even more key figures emerge.
Okay, who are we talking about here?
There's Khaja Muhammad Bakubillah, who founded a major Sufi order, and Shaikh Ahmad Sirhindi, who developed this influential doctrine of unity of consciousness, wadat al-shuhud.
Unity of consciousness. How is that different from Ibn Arabi's unity of being?
It's a nuanced difference, but basically Sirhindi emphasized the unity of perception or awareness rather than the ontological unity of all things.
So more of an epistemological focus.
Yeah, and even in the 18th century, you have Shah Walullah trying to reconcile these different perspectives and make mystical doctrine fit within a broader Islamic intellectual framework.
So this conversation is still ongoing even centuries later.
It is. It shows how vibrant and dynamic this intellectual tradition was.
I'm really seeing that now.
Now, finally, our deep dive ends in 16th century Persia with the rise of the school of Isfahan under the Safavid dynasty.
Okay, bringing it back to Persia.
Yeah.
And what was the focus of this school?
One of their big debates was about the distinction between the reality of being Hakikat al-Wujud and the concept of being Mafhum al-Wujud.
That's getting pretty meta even for a philosopher.
It is a subtle but super important difference for
I
metaphysics.
can imagine.
The school of Isfahan, with Mir Damad as one of its founders, he was a follower of Suhrawardi, and he represents this culmination of Sufi metaphysics, Ishraqi philosophy, and rigorous analysis.
So they were really pushing the boundaries of philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, Mir Damad even used the pen name Ishraqi.
Wow, so he was fully committed to that tradition.
Totally. And he focused on laying the groundwork for understanding mystical experience and the soul's ascent.
So he was building a foundation for others to work on.
Exactly. And his student, Mulad Adra, he became arguably the most important metaphysician in later Islamic philosophy.
Muladran, that's a name I've heard before. What made him so special?
His transcendental theosophy, Al-Hikmat al-Mutaliya, was this massive project to create a grand synthesis of everything.
Everything. Wow, that's ambitious.
It was. He drew on discursive philosophy, intellectual intuition, and the transformative power of asceticism.
So he's saying you need all of that to really understand things.
Yeah, and he even believed that you can't truly grasp philosophy without inner spiritual purification.
That's fascinating. So he's connecting philosophical understanding with personal transformation.
Exactly. His magnum opus, The Four Journeys of the Intellect, is a philosophical and mystical map of the soul's journey. It's brilliant.
So he's mapping out the whole spiritual path?
Yeah, descending into the material world and then ascending back to the divine. He was deeply influenced by Ibn Arabi and others.
So he's building on what came before him.
Definitely. And Muladra stressed the importance of both intellect and intuition for achieving authentic mystical wisdom.
He wasn't discounting reason. He was just saying it wasn't enough on its own.
Exactly. He used rigorous logical analysis, but he grounded it in what he called the illuminative principle, Qaida Ishraqiya, and divinely realized knowledge, Taka Arshi.
Those are some powerful concepts.
They are, and his impact was huge. His students, guys like Abd al-Razak Lahiji, Mirfin Deriska, Molla Musin Fait Kashani, and Kapi Said Kumi, they all elaborated on his ideas.
So he had a whole school of thought following in his footsteps.
Yeah, and they especially focused on his concepts of the principality of existence and the role of both reason and intuition for perceiving the underlying unity of reality.
Okay, so they were carrying the torch for this idea of a unified reality accessible through both reason and intuition.
Exactly. The Adrian school really cemented the idea that mysticism wasn't separate from philosophy, but rather a vital part of it.
That's a pretty powerful legacy.
It is. Now, our sources also bring up this interesting case of Rumi, the famous Sufi poet.
Oh, yeah, Rumi. He's a bit of a wild card, right?
Yeah. He's known for seemingly dismissing discursive thought, like in that quote, rationalists' legs are just like stilts.
Right. So he wasn't a fan of just thinking things through.
But his critique is more nuanced than a total rejection of philosophy.
Okay, so what was he getting at then?
It seems like he had this kind of epistemological humility.
That's an interesting way to put it. So he was skeptical of certain ways of knowing.
Yeah, he questioned the reliability of knowledge from sensory experience, blind faith in authority, and the limits of pure reason for grasping transcendent realities.
So he was pointing out the blind spots of those approaches.
And he famously distinguished between two types of intellect: the limited particular intellect, akli juzi, which deals with the material world, and the expansive universal intellect, akli kuli, which he saw as a gift from God.
So he's saying there's a higher form of intelligence that goes beyond our everyday thinking.
Exactly. And even though he criticized certain approaches, he was a huge advocate for intuition and the insights you get from the mystical path.
So he was valuing direct experience over abstract thought.
Yeah, and he even talked about awakened internal spiritual senses.
Really? So it's like we have a whole other set of senses for perceiving spiritual reality.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even though he was a poet, he had a big influence on later philosophical Gnosticism.
Wow, so philosophers were taking him seriously?
Oh yeah, thinkers like Mulayadra even engaged with his ideas.
So his poetry wasn't just beautiful, it was philosophically insightful too.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, think about what this all means for you as a philosopher.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride through all these different thinkers and ideas.
We've seen so many different ways that mystical insights have been integrated into Islamic philosophical thought.
From interpreting scripture to building these complex metaphysical systems, it's been amazing.
And at the heart of it all is this question of how reason, intuition, and lived experience all come together in the pursuit of truth.
And what's really striking is how this tradition challenges that hard line between rational inquiry and mystical experience.
Right. For many of these thinkers, they weren't opposites. They were complementary, even interconnected ways of understanding reality.
And that's a powerful insight for any philosopher.
It is. So as you continue your own philosophical explorations, consider this.
Okay, I'm listening.
How do these perspectives from Islamic thought inform or even challenge your own understanding of intuition, knowledge, the nature of reality, all those big questions?
Yeah, it makes you rethink some fundamental assumptions.
It does. And what about this idea that philosophy is connected to a spiritual journey?
Hmm, that's an intriguing idea.
Hmm.
Does it offer a different, maybe richer way of approaching philosophical inquiry?
It's definitely something to think about. And here's a final thought to ponder.
Hit me with it.
What if the most profound philosophical insights aren't just the result of logic and observation, but also come from cultivating inner awareness and being open to ways of knowing that go beyond reason?
Whoa, that's a big one.
It is. Maybe the real legacy of this Islamic intellectual tradition is its bold attempt to bridge the gap between rational inquiry and deep inner experience.
So it's about finding that balance between the head and the heart.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe the most transformative understanding comes not just from analyzing, but from engaging with the mysteries that lie beyond the grasp of pure reason.
That's a powerful thought to leave us with.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Islamic mysticism and philosophy.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep wondering.